Have you ever wanted to be a Night Elf roleplayer? Well, this is going to be your guide on how to be the best Night Elf roleplayer ever. Now, don't take this to mean that I'm going to try and tell you how to play your character, because I'm not. I'm not going to tell you that you're an evil special snowflake or something for wanting to really change up and diversify. All this guide is going to provide you with kind of the baseline of what a Night Elf is. A bit of speculation on my part based on some anthropological stuff, some cultural stuff that shows up within Night Elves, and other things. It's really kind of a primer so that you can get an idea of how the Night Elves work, who they are, and why you might want to play one, especially if you're new to the roleplay community, if you've already downloaded the add-ons like MRP, TRP3, but you don't know how to really set the kind of style for your character, you don't know what lore to use. So without any further ado, let's get into this. This is going to be the lore tour for the Kaldori, or the Night Elves, Children of the Stars. So, starting off, the Night Elves were a once immortal race. They are a very warrior-like race. They have a matriarchy in place. There's a few things that you should just know about the Night Elves right off the back. They are a matriarchy, for sure. They are not the tree-loving hippie race that I think everybody assumes they are. They're actually a very much militaristic race, and they show that off a lot. There's a lot of times where the Night Elves really start to exhibit a xenophobia. They have an isolationist streak to them. They tend to be a little bit more arrogant than the humans, the dwarves, the gnomes, and they only seem to have taken in the Worgen as kind of what's befitting their ethos to be a race that's making up for a horrible mistake. They are trying to appease the world and make it clear that they have made a mistake and that they'd like to go back on it. So when you really start to dive into Night Elf culture, there's 5 real primary parts of the culture that you should be aware of. There's the priest, who are primarily female. It's only been in the last couple of years that male-female division has changed, and you're starting to see male priests, but a male priest would be incredibly rare. It'd be like a male sentinel. Both of those you don't really see. So priests are the religious caste. They worship the goddess Elune, who is an actual deity who has showed up to the Night Elves. And she does actually give them power. She has powers like the light, and it seems to be like the light, but it isn't actually the light. There's the Sentinel caste, which is the warriors, the protectors. These are the guys that sit in the forest and wait for the enemies to show up. Usually your huntresses, your rogues, your warriors. This is the kind of job role that they would play. Now, one thing to keep in mind is when they say huntress, that's actually kind of a unique title among the Night Elves. Usually a huntress is kind of like a cavalry position. So the Night Elves, the Sentinels, will usually just be on a kind of ground mount. A huntress would usually be on a saber. The Sentinels would be on kind of the ground. The huntresses would be on sabers. And they would be the ones that would serve as the cavalry position during battle. The other group that you might want to know about is the Druids. Now, the Druids were until recently primarily male. A female Druidess would be incredibly rare in Night Elf societies. They're just starting to show up. There is some speculation that maybe female Druids were a little bit more common than male priest. We do see a female Druidess who has achieved the rank of Archdruid in the Battle of Alterac Valley, which would suggest that perhaps she had some training beforehand, because the Battle of Alterac Valley would have only taken place a few years after the Druids had started to allow the females among their ranks. It was kind of a looked down upon thing, or it's implied heavily that the belief is that the males should be kept to the rank of druid and housekeeper and that kind of thing, whereas the females were the very battle-hardened type. They'd be the ones that serve the household. So you kind of see a switch on most of your Western culture ideologues. Druids also have their own set of deities. These aren't quite as revered as Elune, but they are their own set of deities, and these actually are the reason for the various druid groupings. The deities are Goldrin, Avianna, Ursoc and Ursul, and Malorne. Those are the key ones. Those are the named ones, at least. There may be others. For instance, there is a cat spirit, but he doesn't have a name, so we're not really sure if that cat spirit actually has an official title. Goldrin would be the one responsible for the Worgen. He is a wolf. You see him a lot in the Hyjal quest line, starting to really explore that character. You'll also hear about him a little bit when you actually start digging into the Worgen quest line, but he has a lot to do with the Druids of the Scythe, and the Scythe of Elune, or the Druids of the Pact, and their usages in the War of the Satyr, which we'll get into a little bit. And then there's Avianna. She's probably responsible for the Druids of the Talon, who are usually the scouting Druids. So you'll see them take to the skies, and they'll usually be the ones to use the Raven form and scout out the area, or the Stormcrow. The Stormcrow is far more popular. Avianna herself appears to take the form of a harpy in the game, and I'm not sure what the implications of that might be. Ursoc and Ursul are the ones who are probably responsible for the Druid of the Claw, and those are the bear form Druids. These are two bear brothers. Now, there is actually a great bear spirit in Moonglade, and I'm going to assume that is one of the two bear spirits. The other bear spirit is actually in Northrend, and you'll go through a series of quests up in Grizzly Hills to see what has happened to him, because there's a great tree up there that has fallen, and he's up there and his spirit's been kind of corrupted. So if you do a Grizzly Hills quest line, you'll see the other bear spirit. Now, the final one is Malorne. Malorne is the stag, and possibly the most important of the spirits, mostly because it was he and Elune who ended up giving birth to Cenarius, or who are responsible for Cenarius, who is a half stag, half, I guess, goddess, really. And so he's got that dryad look to him. So Cenarius is kind of the big head honcho. He's the one that ended up teaching Malfurion and some of the other druids how to actually manage their druidic powers. And that's really your breakdown of the druid gods. There could be others. You can make up your own kind of sub-deities if you want to add some flavor. But your character, especially if they are a druid, should especially be aware of at least those. Now, the other cast, there's the Wardens. These probably aren't going to be as common in Night Elf Society. You see them a lot in the game, but that's because they're kind of a highly specialized role. Usually they're the prison keepers, and they deal with kind of keeping everything that the Night Elves hold secret, well guarded. And then there's the Demon Hunters. Now, Demon Hunters are, if not incredibly rare, almost non-existent. Most demon hunters have fallen to the fell corruption of demons, and are using kind of fell corruption in order to help them seek out and destroy demons. Usually they're the ones like Illidan, you'll see with the two blades and the blinded kind of view. It's a very common theme. You see a few of them throughout the game, but they are not well received in culture, mostly because of how they end up getting entangled with demonic taint. So they're, even in Night Elf Society, they're a little looked down upon, and you'll see a few quests throughout the game to go ahead and kill demon hunters who have gone rogue. Now, you need to know that Night Elves probably evolved from the Dark Trolls. Now, Dark Trolls were a group of nocturnal trolls who were in the area of Ashenvale, and you actually see some of them in Warcraft 3. There's the Shadow Tusk tribe, which will join you halfway through the game. What happened is the Dark Trolls probably found Elune, and Elune turned them into Dark Elves, and then finally she led them into the Well of Eternity, and the Well of Eternity slowly morphed them from these Dark Elves into the Night Elves that we know today. Now, what happened in the Well of Eternity, so Night Elf Society was around for probably 25,000, 30,000 years, and it was doing fine. They're immortal, thanks to what the Well of Eternity has given to them. And what comes along as their leader, Queen Azshara, finds this titan, Sargeras. Now, Sargeras pretends that he is a noble god, and that he just wants to elevate the Night Elf people to a greater form of power. Now, by this time in the universe, he's been corrupted by the Legion. So what he ends up doing is he tricks Azshara into letting the Legion onto the Night Elf territories, and this creates kind of a civil war. Now, this is going to be important for any Night Elf character that's older than 10,000 years. So you can have a Night Elf that's going to be 10,000 years or older. They'll still be around. There's not going to be as many because a lot of them were lost during the Civil War and the preceding wars. So their numbers are starting to dwindle. But there are a few out there, and they would remember the Sundering and Suramar, which was the capital at the time. as the place to be. Now, Suramar was actually in Azshara, but it has since moved to another location. It's actually fallen into the sea. It's what would become the Shimmering Expanse later on, because of the Sundering. Now, the Sundering, what had happened? What happened was, during the Sundering, we had a huge explosion of arcane magical power because the Well of Eternity was being cleansed and shut down to keep the demons from coming through. Now, what this did is it basically split the continent, which was a Pangea-like landmass where Kalmandor, the Eastern Kingdoms, and even Northrend were all attached to each other. And there's even a possibility that maybe Pandaria was attached as well. There's some miscellaneous lore about Pandarans and having an alliance with the Night Elves, but I think Mr. Pandaria probably put that particular lore behind us. But so not only did it split the continent, but also split the people, because there were a lot of people who wanted to side with Queen Azshara and keep the demons coming through, because she had said, like, oh, this is good for us, we need these demons. And the traditional Kaldori said, no, this is terrible. Look at what magic has done to us. This is not good. So what happens is this cultural split where you get these Highborn, who at the time were the ruling class during the Sundering. These were the guys who were following Queen Azshara, who wanted to practice magic and were like, oh, let's test this to its limits. And so they did push it to its limits, and terrible things happened. And so these were the folks that would go on to become the Keldori, or the High Elves. Now, the High Elves actually left after the Sundering. They said, okay, look, we're not any good with you guys here. We can't follow the same practices. We're kind of addicted to magic. We're going to go do our own thing. So they actually sailed across the sea, and they went to the Eastern Kingdoms, and they would become what would later become the High Elves and the Blood Elves. But that's a story for another day. Just know that the Sindori, the Keldori, are descendants of the Highborn, and thus are descendants of the Night Elves. And the Highborn that you have in game, the mages that you can play, are actually Kaldori who stuck around in kind of the ruins of Dire Maul and a few other locations throughout Kalmandor. And they continue to practice arcane magic even against Night Elf practices. And what happened during the Cataclysm is just like after the Third War, where the Night Elves had suffered such tremendous losses that they had to start to reconsider some cultural boundaries. Again, the Cataclysm caused such tremendous losses that the Night Elves were forced to re-invite these Highborn back into society, and these are Kaldori Highborn. And they're probably going to retain that purplish skin that's famous for the Night Elves. What happened, why the High Elves have that light-colored skin is because they became more of a daytime walking species. As they migrated to the Eastern Kingdom, some effects there caused them to have that lighter skin tone, becoming more daylight-driven. The Highborn of the Kalmandor area, the Highborn that are still with the Night Elves, those are probably going to retain their purplish skin features. So you're not going to see many Highborn Night Elves that are light-skinned and blue-eyed. They're going to keep that silverish eye, purple skin color. Now, there are two other important wars you need to be aware of. After the War of the Ancients, which is the war where the Sundering occurs, there's the War of the Shifting Sands, which occurs about 1,000 years prior to the game's current events. This is going to be another war where you're going to see a lot of losses. This occurred in the Silithus Desert, and it was basically an old god starting to wake up, and the Night Elves having to deal with the situation. So the Night Elves and the Dragons dealt with the situation, and they suffered a ton of losses, including some major lore characters, children. So this would probably have been enough time after the Sundering that the Night Elves are starting to recover. So you might see a few, your character's children, or even your character themselves, if they were born after the Sundering, might have served in the War of the Shifting Sands, or even suffered losses there, lost family there. Another possible source of loss for them is the War of the Satyr, which occurred prior to the War of the Shifting Sands, but after the Sundering. It's not exactly clear. It looks kind of like it was an ongoing battle. This is where the Druids of the Pact were developed, and this is where the Scythe of, the Druids of the Scythe would eventually come from. So the Druids of the Pact, the Worgen, were released during the War of the Satyr. So if your character was serving during that time, they might have heard rumors of the Druids of the Pact being released, the damage they did, because they would have killed many of their own troops before they eventually got sealed away into the Emerald Dream. Now, there are a few important lore characters that your characters should probably be aware of. Malfurion Stormrage, of course, is basically the leader of the Druids. He is implied to be the husband of Tyrande Whisperwind. It's not exactly clear if Night Elves actually practice that kind of marriage structure with a very strict traditional marriage. A lot of the readings seem to suggest they're more of a kind of a species that chooses a mate and just holds on to it. So you're going to see a lot more, less ritual driven and more just kind of, this is the significant other that I protect and live with, a more mate driven structure. Tyrande Whisperwind is the leader of the Night Elves de facto. She does not share that position with Malfurion Stormrage, and there's going to be a few people probably in the comments who disagree with me on that one. There was some shakeup in the lore in one of their more recent books, but as I understand it, the shakeup had to do with how the priest caste was making political decisions, not Tyrande's leadership. It is my understanding that as the High Priestess of the Night Elf people, she is the de facto leader. Her word is basically what the Night Elf people will do. And unless your Night Elf character left with perhaps Fandral, generally they're going to have a very positive view of Tyrande. She's viewed very highly throughout the society. Another character that probably your character should be aware of is Queen Azshara. She led the Night Elf people for at least 15,000 years. She was an incredibly powerful mage, incredibly powerful. And she was the one that actually led the Night Elf people prior to the Sundering. And so after the Sundering occurred, Tyrande picks up the reins. The male Druids tend to go to the Emerald Dream to sleep and deal with the issues there. And the females stayed up and dealt with all the problems of the world. So maybe there were a few males up, but it would have been a probably female-dominated society for a solid 10,000 years. And that would have had some, obvious effects. There's also Sanja's Feathermoon. Now, she's the strongest warrior probably on Azeroth. As it's described in the book, she is perhaps the best fighter in the world, and there's not really a competition for her. She's the leader of the Sentinels, and she's been basically adopted by Malfurion and Tyrande. It's not really an official thing. It's not actually their child, but they have adopted her as kind of their taking her under the wing. Fandral Staghelm is another one you'll be aware of now. He's the leader of the Druids of the Flame. He was killed during the Cataclysm. He was actually the druidic leader while Malfurion was asleep in the dream, so he was managing all the druidic activities while Malfurion was off. He was also the one that was kind of commanding forces during the War of the Shifting Sands. He took a lot of heavy losses, and he really didn't like the direction the Night Elves were going. There's a good chance your character may have sided with him if they weren't happy with Tyrande's leadership, with the way the Night Elves were going, that they needed more power. So he turned to the Elemental Lords, in this case the Lord of Fire, and began to serve him, and he made the Druids of the Flame. And that's where that comes from. A final character that your character might be aware of is Illidan Stormrage. That's the brother of Malfurion and a possible flirt with Tyrande. He's well known for what happened in the Burning Crusade. He used Gul'dan's skull to corrupt an entire massive section of the Nile's forest that's now known as Felwood, which probably wasn't looked too highly upon. And he also would go on to run his own kind of campaigns and do his own things during the Third War before finally being killed in Burning Crusade, supposedly. And he was a demon hunter. Tyrande let him out. And it's important to note here that Tyrande let him out, and Malfurion said, hey, maybe we shouldn't let my brother out. He's a wee bit cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. And Tyrande responded with, only the goddess tells me what to do, which should kind of give you an idea of, like, that statement was probably true. Like, only the goddess gets to tell Tyrande what she can and cannot do. Basically, she's kind of like the Pope of the Night Elf people. So just keep that in mind when your character's being developed or when you're RPing, that she is really this powerful leader for the Night Elf people. Now, there are two sub-races that you should be aware of with the Night Elves. They're not going to be allowed in Night Life Society at all. But if you want to be, like, lore appropriate, there are Naga and Satyr. Both of those are actually Night Elves. As are the Wisp, potentially. That one I'm going to get into in a second. But the Naga, of course, when Queen Azshara descended to the ocean, when Vashir started to fall, she made a bargain with one of the old gods there. And the old god basically twisted her and the highborn that fell to the ocean into Naga. And that's why the Naga have pictures of Queen Azshara everywhere. So she is actually a very powerful Naga sorcerer somewhere, and still leading what she believes to be, the true Night Elves now. The night, the highborn, as they've been mutated into these kind of half-fish people. There's also, of course, the satyr. This is what happens when a Night Elf is fell corrupted. So you'll see a few of them. Xavius is the most obvious example, but this is basically like the Draenei will turn into Eridar, will turn into their own kind of that red tinted version of themselves. This is what the Night Elves turn into. They grow apparently hooves and horns. So those are just some things you should be aware of. So other things that you might want to know just throughout the land. There are Night Elf ruins everywhere, including the Crystalsong Forest, which looks to be a former Night Elf territory back when it was a single Pangea-style continent. There's also Duskwood, which has the Twilight Grove. Now, there's a few Emerald Dream portals scattered across the world that were being guarded by the Green Dragons. It's kind of implied that they were being managed by the Night Elves prior to the Sundering, and then after the Sundering, that kind of fell upon the shoulders of the dragons. The dragons went a little bit insane, and things kind of went downhill from there. But those are just some areas of note. So your character will probably be aware of those, if only vaguely, depending on how old or young they are. Military culture, Night Elves are basically the shock troops of the Alliance. So you'll notice that humans usually provide the ships, the naval support for the Alliance. The dwarves are usually providing the tanks. Night Elves are usually providing the actual troops on the ground, as well as the enforcement of artillery pieces. The Night Elves don't appear to really have a navy of any sort, or if they do, it's not very present in the game, and it's most certainly not seen or used in any naval engagements throughout World of Warcraft. However, their shock troops are seen not only in the Eternal the Eternal Veil, but Star's Rest, all kinds of locations where you'll see Night Elf shock troops. So it's pretty well assured that the Sentinels are probably the best fighters in the Alliance, and that's why they get sent to the front lines so often. They usually use glaives. That's their favorite weapon. Now, there are actually no glaives in the game that I'm aware of. There's a few fist weapons that get close, but nothing that really comes close to a true Night Elf glaive, and I really wish Blizzard would consider adding it as a weapon class for warriors and possibly rogues, because it really is, so important to Night Elf's military structure that you see it literally everywhere. A glaive is so iconic to the Night Elves that if you could probably equip a weapon, it would be a glaive. They probably wouldn't be using swords or, spears. We see halberds a little bit among the Sentinels, so it looks like they use glaives and halberds, and bows, of course. They're very good marksmen with their bow. But the glaive is the primary weapon because it's a hand-to-hand weapon as well as a weapon that can be thrown. Also stealth to their advantage, a lot of shadow magic, possibly a little bit of fey magic given their interaction with the fey and sprite darters. Don't want to dig into too much of that, but there's a possibility that your character would probably have some kind of shadow or fey magic. Now their racial mounts, the racial mount for the air is usually the Hippogriff, and the Hippogriff usually is grown in Feralis. That's where their breeding grounds are. The Sabers seem to be bred just about anywhere. There's a special breed, the Winter Sabers, that are up in the Winter Spring. Now, those may be a special breed of saber that we don't have as much information on, but we do know that they are out there. But yeah, the Saber and the Hippogriff are usually going to be your Night Elf's favored mount choices. And there's a lot of lore about the Sabers. It appears that, even though the Sabers really only live about 20 years, Night Elves will probably collect their teeth whenever they fall in battle. A very sentimental attachment, and it's very important to a Night Elf that she have that attachment, or he or she have that attachment with their saber. So you could probably look at it as a very important thing. Another important thing to note, just kind of Culturally, all Night Elves, even the males, even though it's not on the model, do have tattoos of some kinds. This appears to be a ritualistic tribal marking, most likely tied to a family line. It's probably coming from a rite of ascension. So most cultures, when you reach a certain age, like a bar mitzvah in Judaism, when you reach puberty, there's indications that you perform a ritual, and that's what these markings are. They're likely a very permanent tattoo made on the facial structure. Another thing to note is I said we discussed the issues of Night Elves, just some miscellaneous issues. Your Night Elf is probably not going to be any younger than 100. So every bit of evidence we have is that Night Elves physically mature at the same rate as human beings. So like a Night Elf will reach the age of maturity around 30. That's about the time that their bodies physically mature. However, as society is concerned, until you turn 100, you're still basically a teenager. And anytime after 100 until you're about 300 or 400, you're basically considered a young adult. After 300 and 400, you might be considered an adult, and so on, with it becoming more exasperated the older you get. So a venerable Night Elf would be anywhere of 1,000 plus. And even without their immortality, Night Elves are probably going to live average length, probably on the same length as a very long-lived High Elf. So even without their immortality, you're probably looking at another 1,000 years, but their immortality is a very important thing to them. You see several quest lines throughout all of the expansions where the Night Elves are attempting to reclaim their immortality. Basically, all of their research is being directed at trying to get their immortality back. Teldrassil is them trying to get their immortality back. So that's going to be a big deal for any Night Elf that is old enough to understand how important their immortality is they're going to want it back, and they're going to give up a lot to try and get it back. Just a few more tiny details. The effects of the Cataclysm. We see a lot of damage done to Night Elf territories. However, what you see in game in Ashenvale has actually transpired already. There was a peace treaty signed before the events of Warlords of Draenor, so the Horde have pulled back to Azshara. Stone Talon is complete. So just to kind of give you a current perspective, Stone Talon, a druidic training facility, was bombed. Ashenvale, a great deal of the forest, was destroyed. And the Night Elves feel the need to preserve the forest, not because they've got this kind of hippie mentality, but because they feel so terrible about blowing the world apart that they feel like it's their duty to maintain nature. And that's really where that drive to protect nature and heal comes from. A lot of Night Elves are probably going to be healers. But yeah, that's where you start seeing that is some changes, like just to give you an idea, because I know the game isn't quite up to date where the actual reality of things are. There's Feathermoon Stronghold, which is probably the Night Elf's biggest military base outside of Darnassus, and that is in Feralis. And finally, they seem to be sending just a small expedition in the form of the small place outside your garrison in Warlords of Draenor, and are exploring in that area. So this is basically all you should need, just this real quick summary of Night Elf lore. If you have any questions, of course, feel free to leave it in the comments below. And let me know what other races you'd like me to kind of do a quick summary of, or if there's anything else you'd like to kind of add to this in the comments below. Of course, welcome to all suggestions, and I thank you very much for listening, and I hope that you have a great time role-playing your Night Elf out there in the World of Warcraft. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.